Welcome everyone to Film Criticism 375. This is an auteur study. Auteur means director that leaves an influential will of artistry imposed on an artwork, particularly cinema. And I will talk a little more about the auteur theory in a moment, but and I have a little bit of a masterclass. This is the second year of masterclass on Dr. Sheley. I got my PhD at Calarts. This class is a Coursera class for Harvard, this new film school installment, and USC, where I have up to my master's. I'm up to my neck in my master's. And then Calarts, where it's absolutely where I finished my PhD and brought in the grand prize and did all the winning hero things. And now I'm cool. So I'm going to teach this class on Griffith authorship only because I feel that it's a topic that we need to cover in this master class. And also, I have my chair at USC on Griffith, and as small it is and as inky dink as that chair may possibly be compared to a grand auteur, let's say if Kubrick or Hitchcock were to do it, that would be much, much bigger. And why isn't because Griffith wasn't really the first auteur, the first person to set up how cinema worked, a standard mode of representation, that we've talked about. But the auteur theory actually comes not necessarily from Griffith being that at the start. It was only years later that he was discovered by Andrew Sarris to be the crowning first auteur. And Andrew Sarris had the auteur theory in America, but the original was on the politics of auteur style by Francois Truffaut. And Francois Truffaut, when he was at the Cinematheque, when he was a young boy, he was watching tons of, as a young teenager, growing up into older. After the war, they had brought in all these movies from America, and they were showing American movies all the time in France. And France always had this thing for American movies ever since. And they were watching so many of them in groups that they could develop necessary differences and similarities in genre and differences and similarities in what they would say is the auteur politique. What Truffaut was saying was that the tradition of quality, or this sort of mature on scene group, which was really good, but Truffaut was kind of bored with them. They put these, these classical films together where the scenography is classical. The scenario meets the photography. It was classical. It would have be set in earlier times, have a stage that kind of built on a stage and kind of this artifice of this real classic world. And again, the editing was 180 line, shot reverse shot. And these are all things that Griffith and Porter had invented in the silent era. There were other silent inventions, especially in Russia with the editing. And the editing in Russia had followed Griffith for so long that they were editing copies of Intolerance when they had no other film to edit and no films to make. And eventually their montage style, just from messing with Griffith's films, got to be the greatest in the world. And by the time of Battleship Potemkin, they were defining how editing actually went. And yes, Eisenstein's an auteur. Now let me tell you about this tradition of quality. If you take the tradition of quality and meld it into kind of a modern form, and you're kind of self-reflexive, showing the people that you're making a movie and that you want them to know that you're making a movie, and they can tell you're making a movie back to them, is self-reflexive. And there's also nostalgia, is this old sense of things gone by. But in the modern world, the nostalgia is we can never quite capture the classical of how the other generations were, because we're so modern now that we can't go back. Can't go back, it's too late. Now, if you take a look at this film by Francois Truffaut, Jules and Jim, you see another one of those highly crafted scenes where they're running across the bridge and they're carrying the camera and they're chasing the kids, and each one of them has shots of them POV in the camera, and they're running through this tunnel on top of a bridge. And you think about how that scene's filmed, and they're breaking jump cuts, they're breaking rules, they're jumping point of view, they're not doing 180-degree rule. They're not doing a 360 shot, although that might all be 180 to the one side. But the point is you're breaking up the style of narrative to create something new out of the old style of narrative that is. And that was kind of the definition of what was an auteur before. Well, Griffith did break up old styles. I mean, you can tell that even Intolerance has some of the sand and stored epic Italian kind of influence on it, and it was a film he wanted to make for a while. And did you know that Griffith actually he barely made all his money back on Birth? And again, we're not going to talk as much about Birth, and I know I said that last time, but this time we really aren't. But it just in passing, it made almost as much money as it cost, which was a lot. And, like for back then, $2 million was like today being like $1 billion, you know. And it was just like that's how money has changed and money has inflated, but also more people are able to get the opportunity of big business and big wealth, and wealth has come with the population, and wealth has come with the years gone by of the cinema, and the cinema has grabbed onto all these things that have made them bigger and made them wealthier. And then when you get to Andrew Sarris in the 60s in America, he's writing about the auteur theory, only now he's writing directors like we are, like directors that leave their personal vision, authorship on a film. Almost every scene in the film, there's a will of the director that is to his sensibility of what he practices in terms of making films that are similar and different from film to film in terms of his will exerted to control the film. And I know that's a long example, but it's basically someone who leaves their personal stamp on the film, and that's kind of a cop-out. But I understand that Griffith was the one, and Andrew Sarris points this out in his articles, that used to put his initials DG on every intertitle, even in the Biograph years when he went from Biograph to DG, signing it DG. Then he must have signed every intertitle on Birth of a Nation. I wouldn't be surprised. There's always a DG in it. In the intertitle, and that's for silent films where they put the block of text in between each visual shot. And in his development of that, we're not really, most directors, when we're talking about the development, we rarely talk about their short films unless it's like a few student films. Like when you're talking about David Lynch, you could say, well, he's a director that already had his style kind of developed in his student films. Same with Martin Scorsese and their NYU, and David Lynch at AFI. They're like sitting there, they're making these constructions of what their future films are going to be kind of like, even though they're so different in these like bizarre, phantasmagoric, like intricate short films. But the short films in those cases are student films that they're making for college that they're actually getting a grade on. Griffith shorts were what everything in cinema was, from Tin Pan Alley to the actual showing of the Biograph shorts, to the point that they start growing in size. Now, not always size matters for whether a film is good or not, but since the mode of representation from the time Manger to the Cross and Judith of Bethulia and all those movies came out in 1913 in America, that was when the feature film really began and was already subjugated to what the cinema wanted. Although there were short films, even Chaplin would make a short film after 1913, and Chaplin would go on to make silent films all the way to The Great Dictator in 1940, and The Great Dictator is kind of a hybrid, but Chaplin did not want to do the transition and actually stayed in the silent film period kind of as a like thing of his to just like show that he could, because he was such a powerful director. That Griffith found Chaplin, I don't know, he was in Tilly's Punctured Romance, Chaplin, and it was in 1918, and it was the first film to show him in it, and it was Norma Talmadge, I think, maybe not. That might be a misnomer. We'll scratch that. But there were all these filmmakers that were making the short films too, along with that. And then around Tilly's Punctured Romance, and by the time of 1919, when Broken Blossoms come out, it's less and less decided that you make short films, unless they're like news clips or like reenactments of news clips or things that are found in a theater that are oddities that used to come before films all the way before the 60s, because they used to have feature things that they'd make just before the film, like feature shorts, feature cartoons, feature newsreels, and you'd all say the Pledge of Allegiance. It was just wonderful and patriotic, and you'd get up and you'd love the movie, and all these clips are coming with it, and they're showing like whatever war is going on from World War I on in the news. And World War I movies were weird because there was one, All Quiet on the Western Slope, in the 30s, and like that goes back to Hearts of the World with D.W. Griffith, and how they're showing these like his flight in hand. And then you get the movie Wings, and you kind of look at Hearts of the World, and you're like, now Hearts of the World's looking more like What Price Glory, which has a few aerial shots, but it's mostly about these two guys on leave that are drunk, that are in love with the same girl, and she like shows them both a good time, and they both are happy, but they're both jealous, and it's perfect. It's the perfect World War I type setting. But now, where you get where we are right now, World War One hasn't exactly started at the dawn of the feature film when Judith of Bethulia is out. And I only want to say that is because Griffith started really going for length, especially after he's heard that the film Cabaret was so long, which was like a 4-hour movie. And it's like this masterpiece movie. It's got all these stunts and big sets and Moloch pits everywhere and backgrounds and framing. It was a sword and sandal epic that came right off the line of Inferno from 1911, or and has every kind of like mythology, has every kind of Roman catastrophe. Pompeii explodes. I mean, everything in Cabaret that can go. And there's The Last Days of Pompeii as a movie too, an epic sword and sandal. And they were making the sword and sandal epics with like an entire cast. Almost the entire country would participate on the cast. It was just this wild get together of orgiastic cinema. And Griffith really, really, really envied that. So in his loss, he went for the Klan story. And the Klan story, which either way, somebody's going to dislike it. Either someone that likes the Klan is going to say that's not quite how it happened, or someone that dislikes the Klan says it's not quite how it happened. And really, in the future, we don't really look at those things and say, well, that's the reason I like it or don't like it. But you'd be surprised that some people still hold a grudge against that organization and some people don't. And it still causes like tension socially, realistically, because you're sitting there going, well, I like Birth of a Nation. Does that make me a flag burner? All of a sudden they're like, or do I not? Do I only support this flag? And it's funny because Griffith's idea of that was to confuse people originally, but then it kind of stretched out that it was this total heroic Klansman based on the story of the Klansman, and here we go. But if we go a little bit ahead, if we go a little bit behind to Judith of Bethulia, what's interesting about it is it tries to be a sword and sandal epic, but it uses the cutting, not the frame cutting of some of those Fouillard type movies, but Griffith uses the classical editing that he invented throughout his short films. And so in Judith of Bethulia, you get a coach driving one way, and then an extra shot of something blowing in the dust, and then the coach driving the same way again. It's like these classical notes that we're not supposed to already notice the editing that's going on in these films. And that was kind of a Griffith decision to make it so we don't want to draw attention to the filmmaking style necessarily. They can see that we boast costumes and we boast sets beyond anyone in the world. We're our sword and sandal epics, but our editing is cut by the book, edit by the book. That everything is either beginning, middle, end. That you don't put the end at the beginning. It's just funny because later today, in a minute, we're going to talk about intolerance and how that whole editing scheme from the classical era was trialed again into this kind of modern editing of shot to another shot of space and time here to space and time 2 to space and time 3 to space and time 4, and each one of those are linked as episodic. And it's flicking between the 4 like it's jump cutting. And I don't think that's a jump cut, it's more of a time-space cut, right? But it's still a time-space jump, but it goes back to where we saw the file the second time through, or the first time through in the second slot. And then some of those slots change order in which they come. So the Valentine story will come like every other time sometimes, and sometimes it'll only come every other 3 times. So you got to pay it really. And why he did that was to draw attention to the way movies are edited. And he kind of did it as a fun, fair way to show what editing was really like. Because he was so down with Birth of a Nation backfiring and going this way and that like his budget barely made it back to the thing. Because the NAACP, they banned Birth of a Nation. And by the time it was off the screen, they'd loaded up as much money as they could. And I know racially it didn't go well. The black audience was usually down on it, except for like Oscar Micheaux of Within Our Gates at United Artists. He got money from it. He liked it. At first, and he liked Griffith, and they were friends. And then, as way would have it, he just got all the Griffith's money and took off. And that's cool because really there wasn't anything else Griffith could do for Oscar Micheaux. He couldn't really teach him how to make film. He couldn't really tell him what to make film about. But he liked him and his black friends enough that they used to hang out all the time at jazz clubs. I know this totally doesn't sound like Griffith, but he would buy weed for Louis Armstrong, especially after they fought in a fighter pilot together in World War I, and then they will again in World War II. And that's just saying because in the military, although there is racism all over the world and all over everybody's ideals, and racism is everywhere, and then Birth of a Nation comes out, even more racism. And then the war comes out, and you got to work with other races. And you have no choice but to. And I'm sure there's some things said and some tension said, even in the army, that are like really disparaging, but that's supposed to make you stronger in terms of the army. Now, R.D.W. Griffith guy that we're talking about now, so he comes off of Birth of a Nation, and Avenging Conscience was before Birth of a Nation. It was 1914, and it was the one right before it. And I think what's really weird, cool about it is it's classically edited. Even more so, it's like almost this domestic melodrama that he'll direct later called Battle for the Sexes. But Avenging Conscience has way more expressionistic scenes, and the lighting is kind of one key lighting, and it kind of has this whole setup for film noir later in history. There's sort of this one key lighting, and the shadows are all deep, and there's things you can't quite see, and there's these characters that are all eccentric, and it's got kind of this German expressionism bite to it. And it's a German story, so you're like, oh, how does Griffith know this? And Griffith goes to film clubs all the time, ever since he got involved with Edison even. And Edison didn't really have anything to do with his life after Birth of a Nation. That was the last one where Edison even got a talk, and Griffith knew that was a mistake, but he always championed his film anyway because so many people liked it. And whether you like it or not, it's got some stamps on it of condemned because of the way it shows a particular race of people, the African American race, as being less kind of like helpless, weak, like confused, and angry and stupid or something. It's kind of how he makes out blacks look to be in Birth of a Nation. Then he's shocked that it's a racist film. They made it look that way, though, because of vaudeville, because on vaudeville they were doing blackface, and that's how they used to perform for blacks. And remember, blacks at this time barely are getting the vote, barely are getting civil rights going before World War One, and they have no way to defend against a racist film. And then all of a sudden Birth becomes too racist even for the mainstream audience, so now they're taking it out of theaters, and they're like, he's just barely made enough money, and it's like, gotta re-release it to get the money back. He's like, oh, but it is racist, but it isn't. Griffith can never decide. Like, I've read interviews where he said he's not a racist, and then I've read interviews where he's like, about to go help the Third Reich build their kingdom. So, he's a director like anybody else. He's got ideals. Some of his ideals are crashing. Some of his ideals never get worked out. Some of them he thinks his ideal worked out, and it didn't. But with Avenging Conscience, he didn't really offend anybody. It's scary, yes, but the kind of scary that we like to see is kind of like the intro to the horror film, like the intro to the beginning of the horror film. And you can see how his work influences foreign countries, whether or not they agree with his filmmaking content. And the style of his films becomes this by the book, how to make either the classic film, which is Birth of a Nation, or Hearts of the World, or the classic film, True Heart Susie, 1918. Everything's so balanced in that film. Everything's so clear and sharp, and you can see the things moving behind them, and you can see the trees blowing behind them, and they're kind of in one spot. They're like in Grover's Corner to Our Town or something. And this guy from the Civil War, marries Lillian Gish after telling her that he killed his own brother in the war, and that was her ex-husband who died. So now he's in love with her. It's kind of this tense story, but done in like this really sweet way. And it's like everybody loves each other, and they're so like looking at each other like with passion, and she's like, they touch and hands, and she's really bashful, Lillian Gish, unlike where she's more like an outward going character. She usually plays kind of shy in these movies, like even Way Down East, but she's got so much animation to give to those that catch her special performances as a dancer or a singer or a player. And she plays these different roles. Well, Avenging Conscience, one last thing I'll say about it, has the Mephistopheles character, with the beard, and the Faust thing where he gets sex and Cheerios, and gets to see things in history that were real, and gets to fly a flying carpet. I mean, the devil really makes the guy's trip worth it in Avenging Conscience. And that it's a full-length film, that it's an hour and a half, it seems just like this pleasant classical film, and that's why I bring up True Heart Susie. It's about an hour and a half. It's this pleasant, by-the-book classical film. We have shot-by-shot, shot-reverse shot, match-on action. Remember, we know that Griffith almost always, even when cutting from scenography to scenography in Intolerance, there's a match on action from one scene to the next, only ironically played because we know we're not matching on action because it's a different time and different place. And so to skip through the birth lesson for today, we're going to move to where he goes with intolerance and what we're going to try and talk about for the next 10-15 minutes. And there's plenty of class left, so get comfortable. We're talking about how in intolerance they're doing this thing that Truffaut is talking about with classical Hollywood to modern cinema. This thing about how to make modern cinema out of old shots of classical Hollywood cinema, not the literal film shots, although you can splice in old scenes of old movies if people go to see a movie in a movie. I mean, that's common even in those awful hats in the old silent era in the early days of one-reelers where they'd show like a lady with a hat too big so you can't see the film screen, and then you're like, oh, take that hat off, so, and then they can see the film screen and it says the end, and we're still dealing with that in movies today. I swear, the movie battle never ends about getting people to be quiet in the theater. You throw your drink at them. You threaten them with an Uzi. People that talk during movies are okay if it's like they're talking about the movie and they're demonstrating what the movie's about in some kind of a special scenario. And in the old days of the Nickelodeons, and even as going on past the Nickelodeons, a lot of people would be loud in the theater unless there was an orchestra or some kind of musical tone to kind of bleat them out. But it was kind of like everybody go and talk and didn't know they weren't supposed to. And then now nobody can use that as an excuse because like everything, the frame, the music, the lights, everything is part of the cinema. So you're like, you don't want to miss a minute. So you don't want to hear your cousin Woody tell you, hey man, that chick has cute legs. And you're like, thanks. Now you just ruined the whole film for me, but I like that part too. No, that wouldn't really ruin a film, but come on. I mean, like, you're not really supposed to like huzzah the film before it's over. You can like laugh in a film, Some people are like no laughing or crying ever anytime. I have friends like that are like, laughter and crying are not natural. They're not a natural part of human life, man. Nobody laughs or cries in the real world. And I don't know why the movies I'm even in that job, because nobody's supposed to laugh or cry at it. It ruins the whole movie. And I'm not talking about interrupting with a laughter or crying. Dude, I've seen some things in Birth of a Nation that are so raunchy that I even had to laugh. And I'm like, why did I laugh at that? Am I a racist now? No, you're not. It's funny because it's done in such a stereotypical way that it's distorted. And distortions make us laugh sometimes because we're like, it's like South Park joke. No, that's not what it means. Or maybe it is, but even if it isn't, it's funny because it's so grotesque. It's funny because it's so blown out of proportion. And speaking about blown out of proportion, so Griffith's like, finally, I'm gonna do the one to apologize for birth, which he had planned. I'm going to do the one that's longer and more ambitious. I'm going to make the most ambitious shot in film history to pull this off. So they had this like backlot studio. And you can kind of see in that shot up there, although my lighting's not very good up here, what I'm talking about, where there's this the story of Intolerance is four different stories. It's like the modern day with this wife and husband, and they're really poor, and they have this kid, and they're too poor to keep being a family. There is the Jesus story, which I'm not going to give much credence to because all it is a couple of shots of like some dudes looking like they're in a Cecil B. DeMille silent film, and then all of a sudden there's like sunsets and there's like crosses, but there isn't much to the Jesus story. And I wasn't quite sure what Griffith's point with the Jesus story was, other than it was intolerance that got him killed, or it was his intolerance towards sin, or there is an intolerance towards evil that we've destroyed the tolerance for good and have the intolerance for evil, whatever. It's a slave being set free. I don't go much into that metaphor. I don't really understand it. I don't know why they put a Jesus story in all these early silent films. My guess is the early public were still inundated with the Christianity and still always wanted to go to the Jesus film. And they're epics. They're like sword and sandal epics. Like in Italy, they're doing them, so why don't we try here to do a sword and sandal epic? And so Griffith is saying, well, this is my apology and this is my Babylon set. So his Babylon set, would be this big, like, animals, statues, and this big 4-point studio that was like down this roster of stairs, and there's like costumes from the Babylon area that are totally exaggerated in intolerance. Totally like, if you have a feather on your hat, now you have a plume on your hat. I mean, it's like these characters are done so exaggeratedly that it's like the sword and sandal epic, but now we're catching back to that Avenging Conjunce, like giant eyebrow dude. Mephistopheles with his Faust beard. Everybody thinks of the Faust beard as the two horns on Ara. It's like, living dead girl, whatever, you're like in a silent film from one of those new videos by a rock star, like Trip to the Moon's all in Tonight by Smashing Pumpkins, right? We love those videos where they take the old silent film and they make it into a movie. That's really cool. And I'm really for that. But down on his luck, Griffith able to launch this film is really impressive to me, because this one costs more than Birth of a Nation. Now we've got $3 million for putting on it. He doesn't have all the money back from Birth of a Nation. Where he got that money is nobody knows, because that's probably why he had to go to the government to have them finish it, and they ruined it, is because he was out of money. And you never know, because you could have like a million spent on a movie and it never come out because you never got the final million to put it out. I mean, it's a really wild gamble sometimes with movies when you go all out and do that. But here we go with the Babylon story. So the Babylon story, there's this female who is in love with these two guys, and they're like peasants or whatever. And then the king sees her as she is a prostitute, and he sees her as kind of this like whore of Babylon type that he wants to take to his own doing, and then he'll stop launching war on the people once he gets her, and she still wants to be free. And every time she gets free, the battle gets raging, and every time he gets her to dance in the court, the war simmers down just enough to let them realize they are fighting because they want to take this peasant and make her like gypsy queen. But then he has other wives that she kind of gets thrown in on. So there you go with the feminist aspect. Another female that's like, she's powerful as a prostitute. She's got all these guy friends in the real regular world of Babylon. And the next thing you know, the king wants her all for himself. And so he takes her up, and she has to totally rechange her life to just be fit for the king. And in this one shot where she's dancing, the camera does this thing with the big set. The biggest set that's ever been built is for this movie. And they do this thing where they start real small. I mean, Russian Ark's a pretty big set too, but that was already partly built. And they put the camera all the way down on this view of her dancing, and then slowly the camera starts to pull back, but it'll look like the screen's frame is getting bigger and bigger as it pulls back, and there's thousands of people in this shot. It'd be almost impossible to do a CGI. Some of these things in Cabaret would be possible to do a CGI because you have to animate all the thousands. Maybe in like Cabaret, it looks like there's a cast of about 1 million. In Intolerance, it looks like there's this cast of about 50,000. And in this one shot, we wonder if a lot of the cast trooped from different scenes, different scenographies to different scenographies. That's what I'm calling these, are scenographies. They're like located units of film that play automatically independently from the other films, but at the same time as the other films are cutting between films, editing between films. So now you're thinking, wow, Intolerance is pretty snazzy. And it's pulling away, and it's so exaggerated that you forget that when you see the statues and you see the people all over the crowd, they're totally, amazingly entranced and moving along with this whole filmmaking process, that they're all in character, that nothing seems out of the ordinary, except for that we're showing things that are out of the ordinary anyway. The suspension of disbelief is that we go ahead and we believe that this is a big Babylonian court, and that everything they do is in fact sensitive to the director's standard mode of representation, although now in Intolerance it's not, because the editing, although the filmmaking is somewhat classical, ironically enough, in the different scenographies to keep the episodes together, there still are a lot of match-on actions, and even between the episodes there are matches on actions. And then to make matters even more interesting, between different shots of them. You'll have Lillian Gish, the actual one, rocking the baby, and it's like the cradle rocks forever. The cradle of time goes on. It's this metaphor of how no matter what, the human race perpetuates itself and keeps going. So it's really interesting that some of the other sonographies, besides the Babylon one, which is the most famous one because it has that shot, that pull-out shot, and then the fall of Babylon is this big war bursts, and it probably has something to do with either she wants her freedom or the king of Babylon wants her and wants to keep fighting this war, or they were invaded all of a sudden, and now the fall of Babylon's upon us. And this is intolerance because it has to do with slaves, like how they take her. She's a slave girl, but she's not really a slave, but she gets made a slave to the king. And you get this whole idea that like any kind of slavery or any kind of intolerance is actually to be condemned. I mean, but like not the movie Be Condemned this time, but the actual slavery, which we had in Birth of the Nation, is all, well, we needed it. But now in Intolerance, like a year later, it's like, no slavery of any kind is cool. And now they didn't put the black thing back in it because Griffith's going, well, we can't use blackface again. They'll kill us at the NAACP. And then, of course, what does Griffith do? He F's up later in his career and uses blackface again. And that time, Oscar Michelle must have been pissed, but didn't even really deal with him by then. We don't have much of their dealings past the Within Our Gates up to Body and Soul and a few other things that they were trying to put together. Some kind of jazz singer movie that Griffith and Louis Armstrong were putting together, but we'll get to that. We talked a little bit about in the first class about everything. We just zoomed through it all, and it seems like I used up my entire speech and courtesy about the whole about how the first setup of this class is going to be. In the other stories in Intolerance, we see that there's a Valentine's Saint massacre, and this is again, the costumes are bewilderingly exaggerated from the French Enlightenment, and it's about to be the French Revolution before there's Napoleon or anything, and there's this whole gunfight that bursts out at the Capitol building with all the monarchy and the prime ministers and everything. And it's old France, so of course they've got their corsets, they've got their long suits. It almost looks like Alice in Wonderland, but not with the typical plottings of that. Because I think if you would have an Alice in Wonderland story, you'd get kind of Griffith confused, because he's not really a fantasy filmmaker. Like he does direct fantasy like venues, but not like in the terms of this story didn't really ever even come close to happening anywhere. Which isn't true even about Alice in Wonderland. I'm not saying that some of these fantasy events don't occur to some people in life, but that's not the way we view things typically in philosophy. In philosophy of film, we view things as the things you see are identified as either a fantasy environment that can never be real because it's defying reality in some way that's abstract from reality's real physical function, or it's a realistic film that's trying to take in everything realistic it can from the world around it and not take anything out of the world around it that would be considered abstract or not of that world. So you see these two tensions of realism, formalism, always colliding even in the silent era. Even as film began, it's like Méliès and Lumière. Méliès being a formalist, presenting fantasy films that can't be real, about like A Trip to the Moon. And then the Lumières who are pulling in all these realistic things like the train coming into the station. And you're like, well, these are interesting film choices, because now in the classical era, you get the combination of two. You get the things you don't normally expect, which are like the editing style going jump cutting, and not jump cutting, but cutting from match of action to match of action, which is not something you see in the real world. Like, that's not how I view the real world. Although when I do go space to space with my eyes, I do tend to focus where my space stops. And that is usually on some kind of objective reality, you see. And if I look at the objective reality, I don't normally see the cat in the hat pop out. But I'm not saying that these kid movies later in the postmodern era are that bad, because they're really good, and they're fantasy films anyway, and kids love fantasy, and we found that out later in the 80s when they were doing the Goonies and things, that kids love a movie about kids that's a fantasy. You know, it's not to be condemned. These kid actors are just as good actors. These special effects are just as good. And they're pulling us through it, but us as adults, we're like, well, we got to go watch Intolerance again, because at least then it's made for adults, and we don't really care if they're made for kids. It's like, but I don't watch so many kids movies because I'm like, they're cool. Like The Sandlot is one of the great movies, right? But we all love it when we're kids. But let's face it, I don't have kids, and most people that watch movies have kids to watch them with so they can enjoy the fact that their kids enjoyed it. There's a little secret for you. They like to enjoy the fact that the kid enjoyed it, so they still have to make the kids' movies good. And then you're thinking, well, did Griffith ever make a kids' movie? And I'm like, Sally of the Sawdust a little bit. That one about the Easter Bunny? No, he didn't really make an Easter Bunny movie. I'm kidding. So we get back to Intolerance, and he's building these sets, and he builds the French set all up. And then the Jesus set is kind of like off and on touch impressionism. It just kind of has a verse and then, or whatever it does. Like, I don't think Griffith was much on the Jesus one. He never really did any Jesus movies, but that's even in Intolerance is kind of making me think it's kind of a flaw of Intolerance, but it isn't, though. It's a flaw only by today's standards, where to go like, the Jesus story has nothing to do with the Babylon story, and the Babylon story has nothing to do with the French Revolution story, and then the story of the guy and the woman that lose their kid, and then the guy almost gets hanged, and the woman gets arrested, and it's terrible, but it has nothing to do with each other. But even the way it cycles together, you're like, yeah, this movie fits together. You know, it has. That's where the original idea from some of those movies like Cloud Atlas came on. Cloud Atlas came in, was that Intolerance idea that we're cutting between, and it's like Richard Barthelmess is in a lot of Intolerance. He's in different episodes, and he's in all over in Birth of a Nation. I think there's a guy in Birth of a Nation, I can't think of his name, but he has 22 different roles in that movie, and you can't tell in one scene he's Abraham Lincoln, in another scene he's like a Yankee soldier, and in another scene he's like a total Klansman. You know, because when they're making the movie, they don't really have the like designation and be like, we're casting the Klansman as Klansman. You know, it's not like that when you make a movie. You got to cast where the cast is needed. We've got the cast for the lead actors already under contract, and we build these contracts because they have star power, and they have star power because everyone goes to see the movies they're in, more so than going to see the movie the director's in. More so to the movies we go to see are for the actors that are in it, not necessarily for the director. I know that for those film buffs out there, well, I don't know who any of the actors are to Bresson's films, but it's a freaking awesome film. You know? It's like, so that's not a commercial film, though. That's an art film, and that's an auteur film. Now, there are auteur films specifically made to be auteur films. These are not it. That the Griffith films are an auteur film, and there are certain styles like the exaggerations, the jump cut from time period to time period now is becoming kind of one of his concepts. The match on action is a very concept of Griffith. The gun battles, you know, you don't technically want to talk about gun battles, but the Within Our Gates gun battle by Ostrom Show is the best one. But Griffith, his movies like the St. Valentine's Massacre and The Birth of a Nation, these are early gun battles before they were really the logic of what a gun battle is, you know. And it's like, so you're getting like one guy shooting here, one guy shooting the other way, and it looks like they're shooting at each other. And if you splice two frames together, you know, you could go for the whole exercise in finding ways that one shot, though, where it starts out small and it gets big. My favorite reuse of that was Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious, where he starts out on this key and no, he starts at the top of the frame and does the Intolerance thing backwards. It starts at the top, and it shows all these dancers in this mansion, and then the camera goes all the way down, passes Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman, goes right to the key, and then we know that key is probably the key that opens the tailings bottle that's going to explode, and that they're hiding uranium, and, you know, I mean... That shot being a reverse Griffith shot was probably what it was written in Hitchcock's note as, the reverse Griffith Intolerance shot or something, because that's what sometimes filmmakers do to see the shots. They're like, well, I saw this shot in Intolerance, and we can make it go backwards and upside down, and it'll be perfect. You know, and that's, a lot of times they'll go for Griffith because he is the senior maker of those shots. I mean, like, that Edwin Porter's Great Train Robbery did have all that evidence of being a well-harrowed shot and a well-narrowed shot. A well-narrowed shot in every film. It gets more interesting when the decor explodes, and it gets more interesting at minimalism. Minimalism and explosion. And Griffith's really, and that's why he starts minimal on this one actor and explodes with the actors all over the shot. I mean, there's a way to start minimally, and there's a way to grow big, or there's a way to grow big and go minimally, or you do two different shots. Like, first you stay big, and this is kind of standard mode, And then if they're messing around with something, then you do an intercut or a close-up cut on the item that they're looking at. Like if someone's holding a key and they're not doing it Hitchcock style and they're just like, hey, check out my key, you might have a close-up of the hand on the key in the next shot, and then back to the regular, well, I got my key, I'm going to go open the secret door, and so you have ways of developing these shots just based on even the objectives around you as to what is going to be in the shot. Now remember, when it comes to realism, we're talking about why they built these artifices to be realistic or artifices to not be realistic. And I'm saying that the realism is the camera shot without anything added to it, kind of taken at a space where you can see the whole picture. Because and we're not using props now, we're not using actors now, we're just taking a picture. And when you take a picture, you want your objective to be clear, focused, But what Andrew Bazan is saying is in these kind of pictures, even in the one I'm in now, on this camera, they're like imprints. They like pop a picture, they're popping pictures every 30 frames a second. Is what we're looking at on this camera. In Griffith's time, it was more like it was more like 22 frames a second. Yeah, because it's 24 frames per second in most Hollywood classical cinema, and all the way up to the digital era where it became 29. So, like, really not until the 2Ks was it anything more than 24. But the 29 is a digital read that gets it about to where the 24 is, and the 22 is just to make it under cranked so that it looked like it went a little faster. And with intolerance, you definitely want it to go a little faster, right? Because it's it's like a 3.5 hour movie. Birth of a Nation, if you can believe this or not, is a 3 hour and 7 minute movie. And if you can get through it, you're a champ, dude. It's almost an A in this class to get through that movie, but I don't really want to force you through it. And it's not fair to our African American classmates, if any of them are taking this, to go, well, I don't want to watch it because it's too offensive. Then you don't have to, dude. And you won't lose points. But it is kind of unfair in this class, though, because I will grant points to those who do essays on it later for the final essay. And the final essay is a final that I'm going to assign. Like, here's an example. It'll be like, describe Griffith's auteur style and how it works in one of his films. I mean, it's not that hard of a final, but this is a hard class because we have to think about things like reality when taking photos of it. Now, it takes a picture of everything that's imprinted. Now, we know this building was here for a while, but it must have been built at some point because buildings are built. And that means at some point somebody put this here, so that is controlled only by how the architecture was already built, not built for the film. You see things in the background, they look like props. You see my shirts back there or whatever falling over everywhere. That is an example of what was already there. So we're taking an exact imprint of this small apartment that I'm in, telling you all about Griffith. And then that's the reality of the imprint that you see in return when you play it back. And this functions to record sound. You got to think Griffith did do 2 sound films, Abraham Lincoln and The Struggle. We're getting them way later in the classes. His sound film expertise isn't too bad. Like, some of the things he does with those 2 sound films isn't very bad. And there's actually something we've got to kind of compress forward to, how he even helped push forward the types of sound films that were more complicated to make than just that we got a microphone in a jar and we've all got to sit around yelling at the jar. And so I'm going to go on for a little bit more. I think you've kind of grasped what I'm saying. But now the difference, if I'm not shooting a reality shot and I'm not just taking in the long take, and the longer the take, we know the reality is still there. Now, if I change to the background with a blue screen or something, which I've done before, or if I change positions, or if I go and there's something in it that I add to it, like if I were to bring in like a little CGI frog that was bouncing around, then we get the idea of reality mixed with fantasy. But if I even changed it up there to have like if there was a big, let's just say this for the spite of saying it, if there was a big Indian headdress in here on top and it was kind of fake looking, it'd be kind of annoying. The Masterclass guys go going, these don't even look like how bad the aliens looked in the Western stereotype versions. But I'm just saying, like, if I had something up there to alter it, it would be an imprint of reality, whether it was political or not. that had to make it into the camera shot. That was either because I wanted to make the camera shot look more interesting, or because I wanted to make it look less realistic. And that's when you've got to know certain things about me, because I don't think it's very realistic to have a big, like, samurai sword up there, because of the condition of, well, wouldn't I rather have my samurai sword where it can be admired in like some like some like uh, award center for just the for just the sword that was in the film? Like, shouldn't it be available at some kind of like museum or something where people can come by and look at it? I mean, I'm not saying I've done some things with museums, right, with Oedipus Marshall and all that. And there's a good example. We put masks on them. This is very unrealistic. If they would have just went through as, excuse me, regular actors, it'd be just an imprint of everything there. But since we found an Old West town, we made the images look like the images that were from an Old West town. And so now the audiences are already ready for that, because they're expecting a Western, so they're expecting it to be in this fantasy world of the Old West, and take that for granted that that's not reality of this film, because the reality of the film is just the Old West. So Bazan is saying, no, 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 no. And Saris is even almost saying this in a different way. Saris is saying, with the real world, we invent what the reality is, and then we expect the audience to believe that's the reality, and the closer to our reality that it is the more we expect it to be our reality. Very good. But Bazan says, no, 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 no. There's only one way to get reality, and that's to completely widen the shot. Maybe colorize it. Yeah, colorize it. Get all the sound. And it's the myth of total cinema. It's that, like, everything you shot fits in it. But now we're looking at production and design and editing. Like, well, you can't edit until it's 5 minutes after the shot, right? I mean, how realistic are you going to get? The longer it runs, the more realistic it is. And the shot itself doesn't have all these like images of weird, like, forget the jump cuts, like the Kenneth Anger jump cuts type thing. Or like, didn't this have like giant fields of like, I mean, even spaceships floating around, and we're still forgetting it. But we look at a movie like Intolerance, because it's so long ago, like it's abstract, even more of a sci-fi type thing. And we'll talk more about Intolerance next lecture too, but it's like with Intolerance, you get this feeling that he really understood, like the Sword and Sandal epic needed this massive amount of production design, massive cast. Really not a star for that one, but although there were some in the Cabiria. And don't forget, there's a Fellini film named Knights of Cabiria that's with, what's her name? Giuseppe, I can't think of her name, but she's a really cool actress. And she's in this Fellini movie. She's in a couple of Fellini movies, and she plays in this Fellini movie where she's a prostitute in Cabiria, and they kind of do a send-up, but theirs is almost more realistic, because they're showing the behind-the-scenes kind of, in a way, of how the Cabiria life is, and it's nothing like the let's climb each other's backs so we can get up the castle wall and create a video game idea. Or it's like the, I'm a prostitute in Cabiria, and I want to complicate your world because I'm basically like the chick from Intolerance. You know, you get this whole idea that like they're playing on these silent films, even in Knights of Cabiria, but it's just the way the lighting is and the setting is in Fellini's movie, that you still get this feeling that we're like in the middle of Cabiria. You know, and we all know that Intolerance is a total wannabe Cabiria. Like, I'm not sure if it's better, I'm not sure if it's worse, it probably is better, because the human interest in the love stories, and then the modern day piece, which we'll talk more about next time. The modern day piece is where this poor couple can't afford to raise a baby and are getting arrested and killed for not being able to raise the baby, but they're really trying. And we're really sympathetic with their characters, even though they've never been in that situation. Really, really like, oh, this is sad, you know, this is bringing me down, because they're this poor couple, and they're in the modern world. They're in my time, you know. And even now you're like, well, I know that's closer to our time, so I can kind of endear to that story. The rest of it kind of looked like Daffy Duck goes amok, and we're just drawing things into the frame, you know, because we're not used to these environments that have been fabricated by Griffith that are so huge that by the time you get to the modern day story, you're like, huh, so that's what the world looked like in 1916. And it would have been actually 1914, because remember, they're shooting all these movies before they come out, so the timeline's a little off. Like Birth of a Nation probably went into production in 1913, came out in 15. I mean, it's not, you don't go into production one week and come out the other and measure me, no. You don't go into production so fast and then come out of production so fast that it doesn't make any sense what you just played up there. It's not like it's not like a play that you're trying to do fast on purpose. So, anyway, we've talked enough about the additions to what we're going to be doing with this class. There's a lot more to come, and we've barely even covered like a small amount of what we need to cover, and that's good because the classes are about 50 minutes apiece, and they run for 16 classes. And sometimes they're a little more than 50 minutes a class. But today it looks like we're getting right on the angle of what we need to kind of start this class out as and get it going through like match on action all the way through. So thank you for coming to Masterclass, and this is Dr. Sheley. We'll talk to you later.